Good evening, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be venturing into the depths of the woods because there are cabins here waiting for our arrival. I hope you're ready because it's time to get comfortable and that the darkness take control. My grandparents owned around 600 acres in East Texas, about 15 minutes down a long dirt road, essentially in the middle of nowhere. The land has been used primarily for cattle ranching for 4 generations. If you walk the property long enough, you'll find remnants of the past dating back to the 1800s, such as a dilapidated brick wall among tall woods, a third of a chimney, and an old general store barely standing thanks to the trees around it. In the middle of the land, we built a simple cabin with a long porch overlooking a 20-acre pond. The first few stories come from my dad, his 3 sisters, and their parents, who lived about 15 miles from the ranch. One night, they were returning from Wednesday night Bible class when they saw a light in the sky. My dad jokingly pointed out it could be a UFO. To their shock, the light got closer and eventually landed in the middle of the road. They could only see lights spaced around a circular object, emitting a light hum. My aunt screamed, begging my grandpa to turn back, but he refused. The object eventually lifted off and hovered above the trees before flying away. When they arrived home, they saw the UFO had landed in their back pasture. My grandpa grabbed a shotgun, but the UFO flew away for good before he could do anything. A year later, my dad and his brother-in-law were raccoon hunting at night near the pond site. They heard something crunching leaves on either side of them but could never see it. Eventually, they stood back to back with flashlights to try to catch a glimpse of whatever was circling them, but they never did. When I was about 17, my dad and I would spend weekends at the cabin hunting and fishing. One night I woke up at 3:30 a.m. to the sound of someone running and walking along the 20-yard porch. It sounded like a large creature with no shoes and 2 legs. Terrified, I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. The noise stopped when my dad woke up. 6 months later, my dad was alone at the cabin, sighting in his new gun's laser. Suddenly, a rock was thrown at him. He shone his light but saw nothing that could have thrown it. The last time I was there, some friends and I heard 3 loud knocks on different sides of the cabin. Given the remote location, it was unsettling, and I'm pretty sure I'll never stay there alone again. I went on a weekend getaway with my girlfriend, and we rented a charming, secluded cabin on Airbnb, nestled at the top of a hill in the forest. Since we enjoy cooking together, we brought along a bunch of groceries that we picked up on our way. The grocery store had a section of loose candy sold by weight, so we filled a few bags, one with caramels and another with chocolate-covered cherries. On the first night, we made a big dinner, snacking on the caramels as we cooked. When it came time for dessert, we considered opening the bag of cherries, which was still twist-tied and untouched. The cherries looked neatly arranged in the bag, but we felt lazy and stuck with the caramels, eating a few before climbing into bed with sticky teeth. The next morning, we woke up to find the bag of cherries on the counter, exactly where we had left it, completely empty. The gold twist tie lay next to it, unfurled. Everything looked as though it had been handled carefully, with no wrinkles on the bag, and we couldn't find a single cherry anywhere. We spent most of the day trying to convince each other that neither of us was playing a prank or had eaten them all. That night, I was too embarrassed to admit how unnerving it was. We still reminisce about this and trade theories. We don't think it was an animal because even something as dexterous as a raccoon would have left at least 1 cherry out of place. Our best guess, which still gives me chills, is that maybe someone was living in the basement of the vacation home, listening to us the whole time. This is the story of my first encounter with the paranormal that I can remember. I was about 8 or 9 years old, playing with my little cousins at their parents' house during a family gathering in Northeast Florida. Behind their house was a large forest. My cousins, their neighbor, and I were playing hide-and-seek in the forest, with the only rule being to stay within sight of the house. Naturally, we didn't listen. I was getting bored of the game and wanted to explore. I convinced the other kids to join me as we ventured deeper into the forest. Suddenly, I noticed a ball of light floating in midair. At first, I thought I was imagining things, so I rubbed my eyes and asked my cousins if they saw it too. When I pointed it out, they confirmed it was there. The light was bright, bobbing back and forth, shifting from a yellowish color to a transparent green hue. We followed it for a while until we reached a small cabin, and then the orb disappeared. By then, it was dusk, and my curiosity got the best of me. My cousins and the neighbor's kid were too scared to approach, but I peeked inside a window. I saw a dim light and what looked like a human skull on a table next to some jars. Then, a shadow moved across the far wall. Chills ran down my spine, and I signaled the other kids to run. We took off immediately, running as fast as we could until we were back inside the house. I locked the door behind us, and we got in trouble for not being within sight of the house. I didn't tell my mom or anyone else what I had seen, not wanting to scare my cousins or worry my parents. To be honest, I wasn't even sure if what I saw was real. Late that night, I woke up to the sound of helicopters and dogs barking outside. It was well past midnight, and I saw my mom and the other adults who had stayed over, all standing in the kitchen, watching something through the window. My mom told me they had found the body of a woman in the forest in a cabin where her killer was staying. A manhunt was underway. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, with the glaring white lights from the helicopters shining through the blinds. I still don't know what that light was. Perhaps it was the spirit of the woman trying to lead someone to her killer. I'm not even sure if one of the other kids told anyone about the cabin we saw, or if it was one of the parents who called the police. After that night, we were never allowed to go near the tree line again, and I never wanted to anyway. I'm 24 now and have had many other paranormal experiences since then, but this is one that I had almost forgotten about until recently. Reading up on will-o'-the-wisps reminded me, so I thought I'd share where it all began for me. Summer of 1980, my family had a tradition of spending a week at our log cabin in the woods. We'd make s'mores, tell jokes, and enjoy each other's company. This week was our chance to see extended family without the holiday rush, so it was considered sacred time for us. One family member in particular was my Aunt Muriel. Slightly estranged, she had only started joining these gatherings a few years prior. She was a lifelong spinster, never married, and apparently never had a love interest. According to my family, she was a miserable person, smoking like a chimney, drinking heavily, and generally being unpleasant. So, none of us were particularly excited to see her. We were told she had arrived at the cabin a few days early to prepare for everyone and stock the fridge. The summer was swelteringly hot, and with no cell phones in the 80s, it wasn't unusual that we hadn't heard from her. We were the first to arrive. My sister and I jumped out of the car while our parents started unpacking. As I opened the cabin door, I was hit with an overwhelming stench. Despite my sister's protests, I went further inside and discovered the source. Aunt Muriel, lying on the floor in a pool of blood, dead. She had clearly been there for a few days. The heat had not been kind to her body, and the smell was unbearable. We screamed and ran outside to get our parents. One sniff and our explanation were enough. They didn't even go inside to check. They drove to town, a 40-minute trip, to find a phone and contact the authorities. About 3 hours later, some other relatives had arrived, and finally, the police showed up. We watched in dismay as they did their work and told us it was best to leave. My uncle took us to his farmhouse nearby. At my uncle's house, we all sat in silence, unsure of what to do. It was a dark night, and we ended up staying there. Over the next few days, the adults arranged the funeral and coordinated with the police to ensure no foul play was involved. It was an unpleasant time. The investigation revealed that Aunt Muriel had died of natural causes. She had a heart attack, fell, broke a bone in her leg and hip, and bled out. She had been dead for about 3 days, practically the day she arrived. Despite not liking her much, I thought no one deserved to die like that. We never returned to that cabin. It was sold and our family reunions were held elsewhere from then on. The events of that summer left a lasting impression on me, and I have refused to go into a cabin ever since. When I was around 11 years old, my dad bought a log cabin in the woods of Maine. The place was incredibly quiet, and while we had neighbors, we rarely saw them. We had already spent a few nights there on previous trips, despite the 250-mile journey. On this particular long weekend trip, my parents decided to get some work done on the old cabin to make it more appealing, so they hired people to redo some of the rooms. At that time, only one bedroom was available for us to sleep in. As night fell, we all got ready for bed. There were 6 of us in that one room: my mom, dad, 2 brothers, my sister, and me. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of boots stepping in the living room. The bedroom was connected to the living room by an old wooden door with a rusty deadbolt lock that looked like it could easily be kicked open. Still groggy from sleep, I heard my sister's voice ask, "Do you hear that?" Realizing it wasn't a dream, I sat up quickly. Both my parents and sister were staring at the door, clearly alarmed. My heart started racing, and my sister's question, "Are we going to die?" didn't help the situation. As my other brother woke up, the boot steps stopped momentarily, then resumed. The sound didn't fade, indicating it was coming from the same area. We all stared at each other in fear, wondering how someone could have entered our cabin. When my last brother woke up, the steps stopped again. My dad got out of bed, grabbed the machete he had placed under it, and cautiously approached the door. He listened for any further sounds, then quickly unlocked the door, weapon in hand, and stepped into the living room. He checked the other rooms and confirmed that everything was clear. All doors and windows were locked, and nothing had been tampered with. Despite this, it was hard to get back to sleep that night. The next morning, we all remembered the events of the previous night clearly. We confirmed with each other that it hadn't been a dream. We had all heard the same boot steps. With no possible way a person could have entered the house, we concluded that it must have been something paranormal. My family and I have tried to debunk this experience, but haven't come up with a solid explanation. If you have any reasonable explanation, please let me know. The boot steps definitely came from inside the house. A few years ago, I visited my grandparents who live in a remote area surrounded by woods. Behind their house, there's a shack, and beyond that, just more forest. My grandparents mentioned seeing strange lights in the woods at midnight. With daylight still remaining, I ventured into the woods to investigate and found 16 black candles, which I kicked down before heading back to the house. When I asked my grandma where I would sleep, she said I could stay in the shack. Excited, I found the shack equipped with a bed, TV, and a PS3 with a few games. Though I had my cell phone, it didn't matter much because there was no signal, and I had forgotten my charger. The shack had one door facing my grandparents' home and 2 windows on either side of the door, one with an air conditioner bolted to it and the other covered with small curtains. I played some MW3 until it got dark, then my grandma called me for dinner. After eating, she reminded me to knock on her window if I needed the restroom and to lock the shack door before sleeping. Later, feeling sleepy, I locked the door, collapsed onto the bed, and left the TV on. I dreamt of a girl knocking on the window, asking me to open the door. I unlocked it and went back to bed, then woke up in a cold sweat despite the air conditioning. To my surprise, the door was unlocked again. I quickly locked it, looked out the window, and saw nothing but the lights from my grandparents' porch. Back in bed with one arm hanging off the side, I fell into a deep sleep. Suddenly, I woke up, paralyzed, with the TV off and darkness surrounding me. I heard a sound to my left, where my arm hung. Someone had a tight grip on my forearm, releasing and gripping again. I slowly turned to see the girl from my dream on her knees, sucking on my wrist. Every time she loosened her grip, she sucked on my wrist, making me feel drowsy. "Hey, what are you doing?" I asked. She looked up without saying a word, barefoot. I lost consciousness again. The next thing I remember is my grandma opening the door asking why I hadn't locked it. She told me it was 5 p.m. and mentioned leaving some chicken in the oven. I felt incredibly tired and noticed a sharp pain down my arm. On my wrist was a bright red spot, and a large bruise covered my forearm. Recalling the dream, I felt like I was losing my mind. The pain extended from the red spot all the way to my shoulder. Unsure whether to tell my grandparents, I slowly went inside. They were in the living room watching TV. I told them about the candles I knocked over. My grandpa said black candles were bad and speculated that devil worshippers across the stream might be responsible. We went to check out the candles, but there was no trace of them. I wanted to leave immediately, but had to stay one more night. I didn't sleep, waking up frequently to check my surroundings. When the sun rose, I finally fell asleep. My grandpa knocked on the door later, and I told him about the dream, showed him the bruise and the red mark. He thought it was the work of evil spirits and mentioned seeing strange things in the woods despite their attempts to bless the house. He said the paranormal occurrences usually happened outdoors, not inside. A few days later, the red mark disappeared, but the bruise remained for about a week. Occasionally, I still dream about the girl, trying to figure out who she is, but she always vanishes. I'm not sure what she was or if she was even human. Perhaps it's best not to find out.